Hello, and welcome to another episode of 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th Edition. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Yuan-ti Mind Whisperer, a polymorphing, shape-changing serpent person that is found in Valo's Guide to Monsters on page 204. The Yuan-ti Mind Whisperer is worth 1100 XP rated at CR 4. The Mind Whisperer can be an epic solo monster for a party of 5 level 3 players, or a party of 4 level 4 players. Considering that the players could solo this monster on a 1-to-1 basis at 9th level, it goes to show you just how tough these monsters are even at CR 4 compared to how weak our players are. Now for the TLDW. Our Mind Whisperer is a DCR 2, an OCR 4, an FCR 3, and its printed value is 4. Now there's a thing about the CR3 here which we'll get to in the later sections of this, but it's kind of unclear if the FCR is a 3 or 4. Now if you're curious to see why this is, let's continue on and go right into the skills and traits section. Looking at the skills and traits, we'll see that our Mind Whisperer falls into the proficiency bonus of +2. So all items here will have that +2 bonus to it. Moving on, we'll see that our Mind Whisperer has 2 saves. Wisdom +4, and Charisma at +5. Moving on, its skills are Deception with the +5, including the Charisma of +3, and Stealth of +4, including a Dexterity bonus of +2. On top of that, the Mind Whisperer also has damage immunities to Poison, and condition immunities to the Poisoned trait. And because there's only Poison and not a very common attack type, this gives no effect to the Mind Whisperer. Looking at the traits that the Mind Whisperer has, again we see the shape changer like we did last week with the Werewolf. Luckily, this gives no effect. Next we'll look at magic resistance. When we look at the monster's traits in the Dungeon Master's book, we'll see that this actually gives a +2 effective AC bonus and something we'll have to add in later on in the DCR section. We also have Mind Fangs. Mind Fang adds damage to the OCR after each of its attacks. So this is something that will be added into the OCR and only takes effect there. Next we have Seth's Blessing. Seth's Blessing is an interesting one. It's similar in concept to Rampage, where Rampage will add in bonus damage after a monster's been dropped to 0. Seth's Blessing does the same except it adds hit points. Now there's no guidance here as to what Seth's Blessing actually does, and because of that I'm going to omit this from the calculations, but this could end up affecting the monster's rating overall, and possibly giving it a +9 effective HP bonus per turn, or entirely. I'm not exactly sure, sadly. Next, we have innate spellcasting, and luckily there's no damaging spells, so there's nothing here we have to worry about that could affect the Mind Whisperer's overall DCR OCR rating, so we'll just skip over this. Lastly, we have spellcasting. And because of the fact that our Mind Whisperer is considered a Warlock, it has 2 spells that we can actually take a look at in the OCR section, and that's Eldritch Blast, which gets a +3 Charisma bonus to its damages, and Poison Spray. Again, these items will be added into the damage of the OCR later, or calculated there at least. Now that we have the skills and traits handled, let's get into the DCR. Now, excluding Seth's Blessing, as I mentioned before, our monster, in theory, has an effective HP of 71. This comes from the 13d8 plus 13 of the monster stats. This will give a DCR of at least a 1. Now that we have the hit points out of the way, let's take a look at the actual AC, which is a 14. Now there isn't much here because this is natural armor, but because the magic resistance, we will increase the actual AC to an effective AC bonus of 16. And when we look at the charts for DCR1, we'll see that the expected AC rating is a 13. Because the effective AC is a 16, this is +3 over. Due to our rules, we'll get a +1 shift from a DCR1 to a DCR2. Okay, great. We have a DCR set for our Mind Whisperer. Now that we have the DCR set for our Mind Whisperer, let's take a look at the OCR. Starting at the top of the attack section for our Mind Whisperer, we'll see that it has a multi-attack. While it's in its regular form, not the snake form, it gets 1 bite and 1 scimitar attack. The Scimitar has an average damage of 6.5, which comes from 1d6 plus 3. Next, its bite attack is a 5.5 average damage coming from 1d4 plus 3, and on top of added poison damage of plus 7 or 2d6. This will average out to 12.5 points of damage every time the Mind Whisperer bites. Now the total multi-attack damage is going to be 19 average damage per round. On top of the multi-attack, we also have a few other items from its traits section to take into consideration. The Mind Fangs, which can only do 2 times a day, gives an average damage of 16.5 damage from the 3d10 dice it rolls. Again, this can only be done twice a day. The next item is Eldritch Blast, which it gets 2 of because it's a level 6 spellcaster. Now each of the Eldritch Blast's dice is averaging 8.5 damage because of the plus 3 bonus for Charisma. And at 2 casts, it'll average out to be roughly 17 damage per round. Next we have the Poison Spray. And the Poison Spray, initially I thought was hitting 2 creatures, but after I looked at it again, turned out it was only 1 creature. Now because of this, the Poison Spray is only doing 13 average damage coming from its 2d12 damage dice. So when we look at the average combat damage, which would be 3 multi-attacks plus 2 Mind Fangs, we get a total of 13 average damage, which would rate us at an OCR 4. And if you'd like to see where this came from, check the description below to see my Google Sheets on how I calculated this damage. It took me a little while to figure it out because, one, I thought the Poison Spray was unfortunately targeting 2 creatures at once, and then I had to correct that, and then just a matter of figuring out what was doing the most damage to get this high of an OCR rating. Now that we have the combat damage per round, let's take a look at its attack bonus. And we're going to go right into the effective attack bonus because nothing the Mind Whisperer has changes this. So each of its attacks gets a plus 5 bonus to hit. And since the damage per round is coming from all of its melee attacks, we're only looking at the melee attack bonus here. Now for an OCR of 4, it's expected to have an attack bonus of plus 6, and because of the fact that it's a -1 under the expected, there's no shift to the OCR, and our OCR is going to be rated at 4. Now that we have the DCR and OCR figured out, let's take a look at that final combat rating. And because we're only looking at the multi-attacks here for its overall damage, we're going to calculate it off of that. Now the multi-attack will give us a DCR of 2, plus an OCR of 4, which totals to 6, and then when we average that out, we'll get a 3 for its final combat rating. Now again, I can't entirely say if this is the correct value or not because of what happens with Seth's Blessing. And because of this trait that I can't calculate for, let's jump right into the notes and see what's going on here. First note, Seth's Blessing. As I mentioned before, it's similar in concept to Rampage. And Rampage again, when the monster drops a target to 0 hit points, Rampage would give the monster the ability to move half its speed and make another attack. Seth's Blessing, on the other hand, gives plus 9 extra hit points. Now, it's unclear how this affects the monster's stats and could add effective HP to the monster's overall rating. If it does, it could increase the DCR from 2 to 3. This is purely speculation here, but if the DCR does end up becoming a 3 because of Seth's Blessing, then we would have a DCR of 3, plus an OCR 4, which equals 7, and then averaged out to 3.5. And because of rules for going to the closest CR rating, I would bump this up to a CR 4, and that in essence would find the final combat rating. Note number 2. Did the developers add an extra Mind Fang during calculations? I'm not entirely sure, but that could increase the average damage from 30 of an OCR 4 to 35 an OCR 5, which would then put the monster into a CR 4. So we would have a DCR of 2, plus an OCR 5, which equals 7 again, as of note 1, averaging out to 3.5, and we would round that up to an FCR 4. Again, this is a potential for how to find the printed value of CR 4 here. And lastly, why snake form? There's no added traits for medium snakes except for the infiltration aspect. Unlike the Werewolf that had a travel speed, the Mind Whisperer uses all of its original stat blocks and doesn't even get a climb speed in its snake form. So why bother adding this trait in? It didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So lastly, is the CR balanced? Maybe? It's hard to say because of Seth's blessing. It's really not clear if this is balanced or overrated or not. I could say, due to note 1, I would suggest that maybe it is balanced, and the CR4 rating is proper because we have a higher OCR and a lower DCR, which is pretty standard when we've looked at all these monsters so far. So whether or not this is actually a CR4 or CR3 is yet to be determined, sadly. And because of that, we'll have to leave this one in kind of a limbo state. Thank you for joining me as we deconstructed the Mind Whisperer from D&D 5th edition. Join us again next week as we take another monster and deconstruct them into its barest parts. Until next time, when we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.